Hey, you're listening to Bob's RPG Radio, your number one station for RPG inspiration. I'm your host, Bob Worldbuilder, and if you like listening to RPG discussions longer than the average YouTube video, I encourage you to subscribe. The discussion you're about to hear is my interview with role-playing game historian and filmmaker Griffith Morgan. However, like any good D&D session, we went into this conversation with open minds, just wanting to have fun, so the topics range from how Griff got into preserving the history of D&D and Dave Arneson's work, to how opposing philosophies on traditional wargames led to the creation of role-playing games, and some of the simple yet timeless concepts that make these games fun. To listen on your favorite podcast platform and support the station, you can join our Patreon through the link in the description, where you'll also find a link to Griff's film, Secrets of Blackmoor, the true history of Dungeons and Dragons, and his team's store at fellowshipofthething.com with books, shirts, and more. Here, I should clarify that this was not a sponsored recording, just a cool opportunity to discuss the history of role-playing games. Now, if you haven't already, I invite you to sit back and tune in here on Bob's RPG Radio. Okay, so I'm here with Griff, creator of Secrets of Blackmoor documentary, Lost Dungeons of Tonisborg, and more. But I think we should start out with you just introducing yourself.
Well, I'm Griff Morgan. I'm one of the co-directors of Secrets of Blackmoor, and we have a little company called the Fellowship of the Thing. You want to go to, in fact, we have a lot of interesting things at the fellowshipofthething.com. That's where we have our store, and you can rent our movie to see our movie, and you can see the game books that we're releasing, and you can get cool t-shirts with logos like the thing behind me here. With all kinds of slogans from, like, I think we're going to do another one that's like the I Survived Tonisborg Dungeon one, and we have an old school t-shirt that has like
nice.
An old map from 1973, which is before Dungeons and Dragons was released, and it just says old school, and it's a level of Tonisborg Dungeon. But awesome. I'm most known for having done the documentary Secrets of Blackmoor, the history, you know, the true history of Dungeons and Dragons.
Right. Yeah, and that's how we kind of first connected. So I was trying to think back to, you know, our first emails. I don't know, I tend to not save like all my emails in my inbox. Right. I am one of those people who tries to keep it clear if I can. So I don't have the originals. But this was probably a year or two ago.
Yeah.
You emailed me, and I had heard of the documentary already because I remember seeing, I think, the Twitter profile at some point, the Secrets of Blackmoor. And I knew a little bit about Blackmoor, but you reached out with basically a free screening of the documentary. So I was wondering if you remember, like,
I think I left a comment. I watched one of your videos, and I was like, because I like to go on YouTube and just, I'm a gamer, like, you know, I'm just a gamer, you know, and so I like to go and look at what people are saying about different games, and I came across one of your videos, and I don't remember even what it was you were saying, but I was like, ooh, this guy's talking about some cool stuff. So I left you a message, and then I was like, I think after that you responded. You just kind of like, hey, tourist, loser gamer guy,
No.
little peon out there in viewer land.
Yeah, that sounds like me. Yeah.
Hi, Bob. Hi, Bob. Can I give you a free screener to our movie? I really like your show, and so I gave you a screener to the film. And then I think a while later, it just struck me that you might like the old school stuff. So I think I sent you a hardbound copy of the Tonisborg book, right?
Yeah. I have the hard and the soft cover here.
Woo! So, you got all the goods. Yeah. Oh yeah, and I sent you some of the poster maps too, with all the really cool stuff on there.
Right. Yeah. There's so many like interesting tidbits throughout all of this stuff. So I guess for people who maybe haven't heard of the documentary, was that, and I guess for filling me in a little on the background too, was that kind of the first big project from you and Fellowship of the Thing as a team, or?
We had done some other films. Both Chris and I are kind of old film dudes. Been doing film stuff. Chris started when he was like 9, I think, doing stuff with super like 8mm cameras.
Yeah.
I started in when I about 18 or so, and so we had both been in film and TV, video stuff for a long time. And then he did one film, and things weren't going well with the edit, and so I had just met him. There's lots of stories here. Like how Chris and I met is kind of strange because we met 20 years before we met briefly in a coffee shop, and I said, "Hey, how you doing?" And he said, "Hey, how you doing?" And we both went in our own directions. And 20 years later, we met again, and I was like, "Wait a minute, aren't you the guy that was doing that arts magazine here in Denver?" And he was like, "Yeah, that's me."
Wow.
You know, and I was like, "We met," and then I told him,
Small world,
we met. This is what was going on. You were having a meeting in this coffee shop because I'm kind of like that. I have this weird, almost photographic memory for certain things, not everything.
Sure.
I'm kind of an idiot for some things, but then there are other things that I really remember. But so then we had done this movie, and we were kind of hanging out. It's like, well, we need another project, and I sort of stumbled back into gaming. Gaming kind of does this in my life, and
Sure, yeah. I think that happened for a lot of people, especially over the last 30 years or so. Yeah.
Well, and it's easier if you're a gamer. It's easier to computer games are easier because you just plug in, and there's a sea of gamers out there, and you can just jump in and start shooting.
You don't need to schedule a time to meet with 5 other people.
Yeah. It's a lot more comfortable calling people names when you're online too, because you don't know them, and you can just log off, and they'll never see you again. But where were we? So we. I don't know. I just started doing that, and I started. I was actually playing with Chris's brother and another friend of ours, and I started poking around on the internet. And my big thing is original Dungeons and Dragons. That's what I know the best. And so we were playing Pathfinder with that group, and I found the rules. I thought that it was really elegant the way it was written. Like, I'm not going to diss on Pathfinder. I think if you're a gamer and you're having fun.
Yeah, a lot of people love it.
Yeah. It was a little too complicated for me, and I felt like some things were just not really falling into the realm of actual role-playing. And because you're moving stuff, it's more like a war game. You're moving stuff on a board, and you're focused on the tabletop,
Yeah, maybe so. It circles back to
so it's kind of going back to somewhere between a war game and a role-playing game. It's somewhere in that space between. And so we just started... I started talking to people on the internet, and I went on some Facebook group and started a conversation there. And it happened to have been Gary Gygax's birthday. And like an idiot, I didn't know all the stuff. There's all this drama about Gary hates Dave and Dave hates Gary, which isn't true, by the way. Because they were friends before they died. They were talking to each other, and they were friends. You know, so all this stuff that between the fanboys is just the fanboys trying to dredge up drama, and it's like, look, we did that, and so I just sort of said, yes, but what about Dave Arneson? And that caused the biggest firestorm on the D&D Facebook page, and I had people in there. Well,
there's the nature of Facebook too. Yeah.
Well, social media. Yeah. I mean, social media is where you go to get your rage out, right? You get so it's too bad people can't see my funny faces because I'm pretty good at doing weird faces at people. Anyway, so I mentioned Dave Arneson on this thing, and the next thing I know, I've got people that I know who they are. They're really famous people from TSR. Calling me words that begin with the letter F and the letter A and the letter D.
Wow.
And I was everybody just dogpiled on me because I was the Satan that had mentioned the Dave Arneson thing.
Wow.
And and so I was like, well, this is weird, but it's kind of funny. Yeah. So, it's just, I don't know you people and you don't know me, and I don't care, right? So there was a guy who started sending me private messages, and he was like, no, you're right. And he would send me links to articles all over the web about what Dave Arneson had done. So being the jerk that I am, I would take the links and I'd post them to the discussion and be like, yeah, but what about this? And so it was like having a candle and pouring gasoline on it, and suddenly it's just... And I did that for about 3 days, and then I started feeling okay, this is really weird. I got this dude, and he's sending me private messages. He's got some weird internet name, and he's sort of using me as a proxy in this huge war. I mean, it's starting to expand. People are coming in to watch. It's like,
oh boy,
old TSR employees are beating up on this dude. This is fun, right? And so I kind of got a little paranoid. I was like, who is this person that's exploiting me as a way to get vengeance on these other people anonymously? And I asked him who he was, and he told me his name, and it was Kevin McCall, and I was like, okay. And then he's like, I used to be Dave Arneson's webmaster back in the 90s. And I was like, oh. And so he started a hidden Facebook group called Circle Blackmoor, and he started inviting other people that were interested in Blackmoor that were really knowledgeable about the Blackmoor campaign, way more knowledgeable than I am, like Havard and Raphael, who were the guys that were running the Blackmoor forum online. And so the four of us were talking about that, and then out of nowhere, Kevin sort of mentions, like, oh yeah, Dave Arneson was trying to do a documentary about Dungeons and Dragons, and there's all this footage.
Wow.
And I was, I was like, oh,
and so what year about is this happening? Like these early conversations
I'm
about
trying to think, maybe 2012, somewhere in there.
Okay.
Yeah, and so, I mean, it was just hilarious because I don't think Kevin knew I was a filmmaker because I don't talk about my personal stuff on social media.
Sure.
All you'll see on my social media is pictures of trains and like really bad memes that would probably get most people canceled off the internet
and just
forever.
memes of trains.
And memes of trains. Yeah, just ridiculous things. Really lots of sarcasm. And so I got curious about that, and we started talking about doing a movie. And Havard and Raphael, they were kind of like, we'd be glad to help out, but we're in Europe. We can't really do anything. So, I don't know, it was like 6 months of doing research in 2012 maybe, and learning all this stuff. And Chris and I have this tradition. We go to this, Denver's kind of known for the beat poets, and we go to this place where all the beats used to hang out, this old bar. And we sit in there and we sip our scotch and we smoke cigars and just kind of, it's like guy night, right? And so I kept telling him about this, and he was like, Griff, we should just go to the Twin Cities and shoot some interviews and see what happens. So we just drove up, like Kevin had Kevin had an Excel spreadsheet that was Dave Arneson's spreadsheet of all of his contacts in the business, in the like the kind of like 70s, 80s gaming industry.
Sure. Yeah.
So I'm calling people that, I have like their house number. It's like, it's not even a business number. I'm just calling them at home because it's Dave's access to them. And one of the first people I called was David Wesley, who features prominently in the film because he it's a debate. He definitely was really important in the creation of role-playing games. You can decide for yourself whether he created them himself or whether he just contributed a piece.
And now you're going to have to fill in me, and I'm sure some viewers here. Is David Wesley the person who ran the Braunstein?
Yeah, Braunstein.
Game?
It's like Frankenstein.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah, it's a Braunstein.
And so maybe can you give a brief background on like how, because you're saying if he's one of these major contributors.
Well, we'll get to that.
Games.
We should just move forward and we'll get to that. We'll definitely get into Braunstein.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just I'm cold calling these people.
Started calling people up.
Yeah, and it's funny because like you're seeing me on camera. We're one-to-one. I'm a complete introvert, and I sort of know how to act not introverted. So, but I was terrified calling these people. Like these are like really important people.
I think most people in my generation also don't like making phone calls in general, just because more used to texting as a form of communication or emails or whatever.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. So, even David McGarry, like I remember picking up a box of Dungeon board game in the hobby shop, probably in like, I don't know, it would have been like 78 or something like that.
Sure.
And looking at this and seeing this name, David McGarry, and in my head, it was like this, this is like a god of game design person, and reading about it and just like, wow. Yeah. And then I'm calling him, and then he was also a little bit of a jerk to me, so I always say that. No. Well, he kind of was like, yeah, I'll talk to you, but I need to like do my due diligence. So tell me your name, and I'm gonna, find out who you are and what you did that's bad.
And then he found your Facebook history and.
Yeah, well, yeah, and then there was that one time when I was 9 and I stole that comic book from the Walgreens and like.
He dug real deep, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, he dug really deep. He had the whole thing, but and then I met him, and of course we got along great. And I was like, "You were such a jerk to me, David," and he just laughed at me. But so we just made these phone calls and then went up to the Twin Cities and did, like, I would do pre-interviews where I would just talk on the phone and find out what people knew, and then we could do the interview and we could sort of rehash it. And we went up and we spent a lot of money, like 10 days shooting, and we didn't even know, I mean, we could have gone up there. I mean, the whole thing is just, at its core, at least for most gamers, it's like, did Gary invent role-playing or did Dave invent role-playing, you know?
Sure.
So we could have gone up there and all of Dave Arneson's friends could have been like, oh yeah, Dave was a complete jerk. Gary invented role-playing, and it would have been like, oh, okay. We're going to go home with this really bad footage and lick our wounds, you know? But instead, what we discovered was this like really complicated, convoluted story that was really hard to untangle, actually, to make the movie. And and so, like, I don't know, interrupt me if you get anything you want to ask me, but I can go, so I'll just keep going if you want to go.
I was going to say, so far we've already hit some of the things I had written down, which were what inspired you to begin this work, you know, kind of preserving the game's history.
Yeah.
I guess it kind of started with a Facebook conversation one day, and then, you know, meeting the right people online. And then the other one, my follow-up to that was, I guess, okay, here's one that's more chronological. So Dave Arneson's Blackmoor game.
Yeah.
And maybe we can get into, like, the Bronstein stuff first.
Yeah.
But trying to set up this timeline of, like, when this was happening, like Dave Arneson and his friends, you know, the Blackmoor bunch, kind of coinciding with, I think, when Gygax would have been developing chainmail on in his realm.
Yeah.
And then, like, how these things kind of wove together later on. Like, what is the order of events for that?
It's complicated because I think that, Arneson used the chainmail rules with his Blackmoor games. But it was not the only thing that he used in his rules. And by the time Arneson... I
didn't even know that was part of his inspiration for Blackmoor.
But it's not his inspiration for Blackmoor. It's just some of the rules that are out there, you know.
Yeah.
If you go to, like, John Peterson's blog, Peterson basically, he's very polite about it, but the whole fantasy section in Chainmail wasn't created by Gary Gygax. Gary Gygax plagiarized that and stole that from Leonard Patt. Leonard Patt had a fantasy game, and he basically stole it and put it in Chainmail.
What's
nearly
the name
verbatim.
Of that game?
I think it was just like the fantasy game. You know, it was a Lord of the Rings battle game.
That's news to me. That's news to me. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there are so many little details that you can go into.
Sure.
So it's hard to say, like, what the inspiration is. I think the real inspiration is that they were doing, beginning from about 1963 when their first wargame group forms in the Twin Cities. And it evolves. It has a lot of different names and evolves over time. But they're doing these things to create, they want their war games to be more realistic. And so what they're trying to do is create something closer to the experience of really being a general. So it's like you've got your troops and you can look at you're playing on a table, you can look at the battlefield, but maybe you have to, like, say what the orders are for your troops, and maybe you roll a die to determine if they even get their orders. So I mean, if you read about, these guys are like history nuts, and if you read famous battles, like Gettysburg is a perfect example. Like the Confederacy has this battle plan, and it takes like 4 hours for one of the generals to decide to even start advancing his troops because he doesn't feel like they're ready yet. So it's like, nope, we're going to have breakfast first, then I'm going to have everybody check their guns, then we're going to, like, polish our shoes, and then maybe we'll have this battle, you know. And so they're doing all these things to try to create the fog of war, and essentially what they do is they start using elements that are part of the role-playing game in their war games, and these accumulate over time, and then before long they start to do things where they're playing the leaders of countries, and so they're playing as individuals, but instead of being like me in the dungeon hacking it out, I'm telling my navy to go over there and kick their butt over there. Like, there are pirates down there. Go to sink the pirate ships, you know. I'm not doing it. My pirate ships are doing it. But it's still a role-playing game because you're role-playing being the leader of a country. And they're writing each other letters, too. In the movie, there are a bunch of of their old letters, and they're writing to each other and addressing each other as like Peter, the king of this place. And I think Peter was the king of Spain. And Peter writes a letter back, and he's like, I'd like to cement our alliance, and I'm offering like the Queen Mother as in marriage to your country. And if we have a marriage between our nobles, then we will be, that will cement our alliance, and we will take over. They're doing stuff like that. So I don't know. It's pretty astounding,
Right.
And so,
because that sounds like I would say very like advanced role playing compared to what we get today most of the time, which is more of, I didn't really think of a backstories, but I'll do this. I mean, it covers a whole spectrum. Different people get way into it. Different people don't. But yeah, that sounds like more than I think a lot of people understand today, more than what people expect went on back then. Because I think the modern interpretation of a lot of like the old school stuff is that it was very just hack and slash and, knock down the door and get the gold and whatever. So it is interesting hearing how, well, of course, this role-playing game was originally something that emerged out of these war games and really playing sometimes a very in-depth role of that person leading the war.
Yeah. So. Well, the hack and slash thing is kind of a myth too, because the older games are not heavily nerfed, and since they're based on war games, even though the NPCs and the monsters are considered to be, they're cannon fodder theoretically, but the way the rules are designed is they have as good of odds in hurting the players as the players have in hurting them, and so. The older play style
really just cut down a whole like crowd of kobolds that easily, I guess. Yeah.
Oh my God! Well, that's a perfect example. I had a room with 4 kobolds, and they were up on this elevated thing, and we were playing OD&D, and the party comes in. I got 4 kobolds with bows on these little balconies. I got a party of 12 characters, some of them in plate mail. I mean, they're this big meat shields, right? And the kobold, I'm rolling hot as the dungeon master. I didn't kill them, but I took them all down. So many hit points. They were like, okay, end of adventure. And it was like the 3rd room into the dungeon that day,
Gotta go rest.
Yeah. They were like, okay, we're going back to town, and we're going to spend a week in town recovering and, getting bandages.
And then strategizing for maybe buying some bows. Yeah.
Well, what they did was they found somebody that would build them this big, like reinforced, it was basically like a giant plank. And they ran in there, and they used it as a shield, and then they threw it on. Like, it was like the siege of the kobold balcony.
Awesome.
And they tilted it, and they ran up.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a really cool example of how an older game system that is more, rules light allows for so much more creativity in the long run. Because, like a lot of gamers today, it might be... especially like you referenced Pathfinder earlier, like there might well be rules for carrying some kind of shield that multiple people can carry at once. Like that might exist in the game. I don't know if they have like siege equipment, stuff like that. But then it would be something that the game has to kind of like stop for and, we'll find the right book or the right resource for or whatever. Whereas in this, granted, different GMs will have different approaches. I don't know how like flexible you are on the spot with stuff. But it could have been flexible. It could have been something that you resolve pretty quickly. It could have been something you go back and forth with the players for a while. But
I'm a grip it and rip it dungeon master, and so I like a lot of carnage in the game. And like people play with me because they know they're just gonna get thrashed. And I either the party has like a bunch of hirelings that go along with them, and as the players lose their characters, it's like, okay, you're gonna play the dwarf now, the hireling dwarf, and that becomes their main character, or I'll have them just have 2 characters. And I warned them outside of game, a little metagaming. It's like, do not have your 2 characters standing next to each other, because if one gets fireball, other gets fireball. Put them in different, the party's going to be like 12 to 20 characters, and you're going to go in there, and it's just going to get rough, But yeah, as far as like making things up on the spot, and I like the whole, you're using the whole environment to deal with the environment. So it's like, well, we need, I don't know, like take the door off the hinges and use it as a bridge to get over a pit,
And so, like you had mentioned earlier that, gaming has kind of like waxed and waned in your life. but around this period, like 2010s, 2012,
Yeah.
you were playing OD&D at the time?
Well, it's funny because when we did all the research on the movie, one of the things I really liked the Pathfinder, the D20 mechanic, which comes out of third edition, right? And I thought that was really cool. So I made up a really stripped down version of the rules, which was, and I put in spell points because I like spell points instead of the slots. And I just created this really simple rule system, and it was a D20 system, but like on 2 pieces of paper. And I started this campaign, and it was set. I did a mashup of a couple different old games. One is Empire of the Petal Throne, and the other one is so it's kind of like original Dungeons and Dragons, but kind of 3E, but kind of Empire of the Petal Throne. And then I mixed that with Metamorphosis Alpha, which is this colony spaceship going through space. Okay. And so I set the game on a space station over the planet Tecumel. And I didn't tell my players, but they actually were playing like these giant spiders. And so they start, and the whole experience of starting the game was that they start and they're like, yeah, you're all in these sort of balloons. They're opaque, and and it's the sunrise. And so I describe the light. They can see it through this, and they're in these balloons. And eventually, long story, they figure out how to get out of these balloon things that shatter. But they don't, and they keep running into these people that I describe as the sausage people. They're kind of puffy, and they're different from spiders, right? They're the humans, of course. And so I did this whole like kind of off-the-cuff thing. But what I did was I decided in my head what the landscape would look like. And I covered Chris's dining table, this huge dining table, with brown paper. And I had colored pencils. And as they explored, we would just draw on the map what the terrain was there and what they were seeing. And when we started doing the movie, I mean, I didn't know this before. I'd never read this before. Apparently, when Dave Arneson would run his the Napoleonic miniatures battles, but then also when he did Blackmoor, he would cover his table with brown paper and he would draw the terrain on the brown paper. And so in a way, I just somehow stumbled upon imitating exactly what Dave Arneson did when he started Blackmoor, only it was for this weird mashup campaign that I ran. It was totally bizarre. It was fun. My players were really perplexed, though, because they got clues, that something wasn't up, but they never figured out that they were giant spiders, and that was hilarious.
And so, like, this campaign that you ran, and maybe for, like, giving us a reference of, like, Dave Arneson's early stuff, like, when we talk about a campaign today, people have different ideas about what that means, whether it's, like 5-10 sessions, or whether it's a thing that can take place over years, in some cases even decades. Like how long, maybe, like, when you're running these games, like with the more stripped down system like this, how long does that progress for you in terms of, like, maybe the time in game and then the time in real life, and about how long, like, how is that different or similar to what Arneson was doing back in the day?
Well, that's kind of a weird thing. I hear people talk, they say campaign, and to me it sounds like, oh, you finished the module, right? Sure. Like, if you finish a campaign like in a year and everybody's reached 20th level together and nobody's died, I'm like, that's not my idea of a campaign. I mean, I know people, like the group I was playing with here in Denver, that was Chris's old group, like the guys he started gaming with. Their campaign that they're still playing and has gone through every edition of D&D started in 1979. And their characters are now like major players in the world. They don't play them.
Sure.
Or they play them like...
Oh, okay.
Like, I was playing, and then we needed to go talk to the church, and the paladins came to talk to us. And suddenly, like, I didn't expect this. 2 players got up, and they were like role-playing their old characters that had gone out of play and were major NPCs and rulers. And so the paladin leader and like the cleric came and talked to us and explained that we needed to go on this mission, and so they like assumed another role for a little while.
Right,
and
they cycle through these different characters and as other ones kind of become part of the world eventually.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And so like this campaign I ran it for about a year. I mean, this is the problem with having Chris here, is he gets to hear all the secrets, because it's not done yet. They're done with those characters in that setting, but that setting is also part of Blackmoor, Like Blackmoor exists as a planet It's kind of interesting because Blackmoor is connected to Greyhawk. But then
Okay.
when Arneson released Blackmoor as a game product through Judges Guild, he connected it to the Wilderlands of High Fantasy by Judges Guild. So I like to think of Blackmoor as being sort of it's sort of like in the dreaming of the gods. It's almost like in another dimension that's parallel to everything, and you can drift into it, cross into it from other places. And Blackmoor, when it first started, John Snyder, who was one of the players, when he showed up, he started running a sci-fi RPG before D&D was even published. And we actually have found drafts. We're going to be publishing like the oldest sci-fi RPG ever created.
Cool.
David McGarry, Dungeon Board Game, is like the lead editor on that. John Snyder's the author. He started this campaign, and it followed sort of the format of the other campaigns, where it starts out as exploration, and then it goes into sort of like a domain game where people are rulers of realms. So they're all rulers of realms when they start in the space game, and they're going out exploring space and trying to expand their empires. But then they need to accomplish like really specific things like commando raids or just, or even a diplomatic journey or something. And now they're playing individual characters. So they kind of play in many different.
Okay.
They assume different roles, different people at different scales. And so Snyder put Blackmoor as a planet in his campaign, it was published by TSR. 2 parts were published, the Star Probe and the Star Empire, but the Star Master RPG was not published because of all the drama with Dave Arneson and all that. Where was I going with that? Oh yeah, so Blackmoor exists in all these different places. So when Arneson goes back to the Twin Cities after his falling out with Gary, who's he going to game with but Phil Barker, who's running Empire of the Paddle Throne. And so he's playing in Barker's game, and then one day Barker's tired of DMing. He's been DMing for years. He's running out of ideas. So they switch seats. One of the players found this magical eye. It's a technological device, and he presses the button. The 2 get up, and they switch seats, and suddenly the players from Tecumel arrive in Blackmoor. And the first thing they run into is Gertie the dragon, and she's like huge, And so like all these, all the old campaigns still are running. Blackmoor is still being played by original players, being DM'd by original players. So, wow, that's a long answer. Yeah, so my idea of a campaign is that it can last at least 50 years.
It might never end.
It shouldn't.
There we go.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And this connects to another question I had then, is that, and actually I'm going to pull out Tanasporg for this, because it was inspired from a line from Greg Svensson in the beginning of this here, where he says, let me grab it. We wanted to play in the world of Blackmoor, but we couldn't use the town of Blackmoor itself since that was Dave's territory. And of course, this then leads to him, to Dave just pointing out, a region on the map in the city of Tanasporg that Greg could kind of turn into his own thing. So what are your thoughts on this concept of individual referees kind of having their own territory? Whether that be like as part of a shared world or like what comes to mind with that?
Well, I think it should be that way. I think that people should be, like there's this whole thing that's kind of come up over time of like the forever DM,
Sure.
And so my thing also is like, D&D is just one product of like millions that are out there now.
Oh yeah.
And so, you can have a shared world where everybody's sharing DM duties. And so it's like, well, if we go over to explore over here, that's so-and-so's area, so he's going to take over as DM. Maybe their character is just an NPC that tags along and, is just there with the party, or however you want to handle it, as long as it's fair, right? And as long as they're having fun. Or the other option, of course, is just playing a lot of different games, because I get tired of just one thing. I want to play everything,
Sure.
We're going to go sci-fi.
I'm thinking about this idea of like, Blackmoor was Arneson's thing, and then with his, like among his players, they wanted to kind of branch off and create their own little game. I guess it was at a time when he wasn't able to run for them for some reason, so they wanted to kind of continue in the world, but in a different area. But of course now, and even as early as, I think it was 77, you said, when the Blackmoor supplement was published, Of course,
75, I think it was Blackmoor.
Oh, 75.
Yeah.
They were,
Maybe 76, I forgot.
They were opening it up so like anybody can run their own Blackmoor game. And
Yeah,
of course now
yeah.
like you're kind of doing a similar thing with Tannisborg. So what do you think about, I guess, that idea of how like these original players had this idea of like, okay, they kind of want to preserve that. Like, we're not going to run Blackmoor because Dave needs to run Blackmoor.
Right.
But then even Dave and Gygax went on to like, okay, well, we can publish Blackmoor so anybody can run it. Like, how does that
Right.
like work in your mind with like,
Well,
okay,
you gotta-
there's this original vision and then like everybody's still having a chance to play it because of course you want to share that with the world somehow. So,
Yeah. Well, you got to think of like Blackmoor is a town.
Sure.
And then the setting originally, he calls it, adventuring in the Black Moors, and so the domain area is the Black Moors. When it was first created, they were doing like a war game campaign, and the idea was that they had an organization they had started at the convention at Gen Con, and they were going to do medieval like sort of campaigns where people they rule their domains and they have armies and they can have alliances and they have wars with other people. And the idea was that they would get together locally and have battles, or they would all meet up at Gen Con once a year and do their medieval battles. And so Gary had this Greyhawk world setting that he'd invented as a kid. But it wasn't for role playing. It was more he loved the Conan books and all these other fantasy books, and he wanted to write books. So he was inventing a literary setting. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
And so he had this map, and he described it over the phone as what we've been able to determine to Dave Arneson. He said, like, well, this is what the world is like. You got this over here, this over here. And Dave took this area that was a marsh and decided to call it Blackmoor. And it was like just this wasteland on the northern end of the map that Gary hadn't really developed that much. And so Dave kind of took to that, and as far as we know, I think Dave Arneson talked about he found an old map of an old Dutch map, and so that's the reason it's like very lowlands and lots of canals and things. It's a very old. It's when the Netherlands aren't exactly being terraformed by big dikes everywhere to reduce how much water is there. It's like this marshy place, and so he took that and evolved that into his Blackmoor campaign. So it's like, Greyhawk and Blackmoor are very connected as far as they both exist in the same world.
Yeah. I mean, again, that's very helpful thinking about the timeline again, because I guess I don't think I've heard that. Maybe that comes up in the documentary and it slipped my mind, but then Blackmoor sort of sprouted a little bit from Greyhawk in that way. Of course, he developed it himself. But I didn't even know that it came off that map.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that Gygax originally was creating Greyhawk as more of, like you said, a literary setting.
Yeah, he had and it wasn't until, at that point, they've got really rudimentary rules for medieval warfare. They've released a version of chainmail, which they're like the official rules of the Castles in the Crusade Society. They're published in Domesday Book, which was their fanzine. All those guys had fanzines that they'd print out. They'd churn them out with like mimeograph machines, and everybody who was a member would subscribe and get an issue. It was cool, And so they had their own rules for playing with. But as far as we can tell, Arneson had his own rules, which were more likely derived from Strategos by Totten, the 1880 rules by Totten. Because there are variants, it wouldn't be hard to take like Strategos A, which is the Ancients rules system, and just reduce the size, the troop sizes. And, instead of having like 10,000 men in the army, you're dealing with little medieval armies of like 1,000 men. And it even has hit points in it. That's the interesting thing. That's from about 60. It's before chainmail. The elephants in that have hit points, which was something a researcher, Michael, I want to say Wittig, discovered.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating, because hit points, that's one of the things that people always say, like, oh yeah, like that's, one of these other things from D&D that, people now associate it with video games, but it predated that by a long shot.
Yeah. And that's the other thing. I just wanted to make one other point about Blackmoor.
Sure.
It's set in lowlands. It's marshy. There are a lot of huge waterways. Like they're like the size of the Mississippi going through there. And the reason is because Dave Arneson was an like a huge naval warfare fan. And so his, he wrote, before they did Dungeons and Dragons, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson published Don't Give Up the Ship together. And I mean, like, when you want to trace rules, like Don't Give Up the Ship, I have an original draft. I have a stack like this of original drafts that Dave had sitting in his closet. They're like a 12-page rule set. And what's interesting is that game, too, has a reference. They use the morale rules from Strategos. And it's not the Strategos rules from the original. They're the Strategos rules from Wesley's variant, Strategos N.
Okay.
So, like, all these games are like, it's so clear that they're using Strategos for almost everything they do because they really like those rules. And that's where they get role-playing out of, is Strategos. So,
okay.
So
then fill in me and probably the listener here, because Strategos only rings a bell from the documentary. I really don't know anything else about it besides what's mentioned there. This was, is this a war game? Because you're saying that this was kind of the source of role playing.
It's a professional war game.
But it encouraged, like, it was literally in the sense of you are a general, like, using this game, or was it still okay?
Well, it was like it's. You go back and they have, I forgot all the names. There's like I think Austrian and German war games. There's the Kriegspiels. And back in that time period before Strategos, or maybe even around the time that Totten is writing Strategos, they're having a lot of debates about how a war game should be run. And so the traditional way of running a war game.
The debate hasn't ended, is all I want to say.
Right. But these are professionals. These are like generals of armies, you know. And they're like, no, it has to be deterministic. I know that if my heavy cavalry attacks that light infantry unit, they're going to thrash them. It's going to do exactly this much damage, right? And then there were other people who were, I don't even know if it was called Free Kriegspiel back then. I think that's a term that maybe came up later. But that was referred to as rigid Kriegspiel, like almost like a game of chess. It's like, if I move these troops here, my troops are just going to do what I want them to do. And when I move them there, they move this much and they do this much damage, okay? Then there were other people that were like, well, wait a minute, you're not really training your generals and your colonels and all your officers to lead troops if they're in a situation where what they want to do always happens how they want it to do, because we know for a fact that once you get into a battle, things just go wrong, and you've got to learn to react.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, you've got to learn to react to the chaos, right?
Yeah, because I think you said earlier on in our discussion how a lot of what these guys were developing was just ways to introduce what you called the fog of war.
Yeah.
So it's all the random chance. And I guess that's, I don't know if it was as early as Kriegspiel, but like this is ultimately the idea that led to, hey, we should get some dice in this game to create a level of chance. Yeah.
Yeah, dice or cards or something, right?
Okay.
So that, and maybe not even as far as like the combat of how much damage you do, but, like, are your troops going to do something stupid? Like, I want you to all strip off your clothes and swim across that river and then attack those guys with nothing. It's like,
yeah, you're going to need a persuasion check on that one.
I need a persuasion. Yeah, it's a morale check. Persuasion is, morale checks, reaction rolls. It's all reaction rolls, basically. And so, I don't know where I was going with that. But yeah, you have all kinds of things that you want to roll for. And then you run into the problem of like the design issue of like, if you don't have computers and you're doing this all on paper with, pens and quills, quill and paper game, and dice and stuff, the more detail and the more granular you get, the longer it's going to take to do anything,
True.
And so, so there's a little bit of streamlining, and all the different games are streamlined, but and that was kind of like. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that was something that came up in the making of the movie. That's in the movie where they do. I think it was Steve Rockford is he's a businessman, so he's very analytical. He runs this like big LGBTQ magazine in the Twin Cities, and he's like really sharp. And he was the one that brought it up, and I was like, "Ooh, I got to put this in the movie," because it's like most gamers don't think about that. Like how many rules do you need to make it enjoyable? But if you have, how long is it going to take to play the game?
Well, and it's funny, too, because another thing that came up when I was flipping through Tannisborg, again, like kind of preparing for this, was how, I mean, or maybe it was even from your blog, but just the sentiment that, as long as you're having fun, that's fine.
Yeah.
And of course that's gonna change for everybody. But what was wild to me is thinking about how even 50 years ago they were having like the same discussion about like, well, we can do it this way, or we can do it this way. Well, but it'll be streamlined if we do it this way. Yeah. And it's like we just keep kind of having these same conversations, decade after decade. It sounds like.
I had
and of course, like the game has changed. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I had the same when Advanced Dungeons and Dragons came out. I was like, oh God, it's so like heavily nerfed. It's like it's nerfed, and the players are so buffed, and it's so easy now, and they got so many rules. We don't, like everything that people say, like between whatever edition and 5th edition. I said between 0 edition and 1st edition.
Yeah, and let me bring up something I did see on the blog then too. I don't have the whole quote, but actually, I think I could find it real quick. I did have it.
I tend to be a little provocative on the blog.
I hadn't looked at it until this. So you wrote, there's a blanket term of the OSR, so Old School Renaissance, Old School Revival, for anything that is not the current D&D edition. I would add 5e is now part of the OSR realm of editions.
Oh yeah.
So could you expand on that? Because I feel like a lot of people who might come to this podcast or video are more interested in the old school realm of things, and I think for a lot of these people to hear that 5e is now part of old school, what does that mean? So
well, and you can play 5e exactly the way you can play 5e in the style of a 0 edition game. All you got to do is remove a couple of rules that buff the players too much, like the extended rests. It's like you go into the dungeon, you don't get anything back till you're done. And the deeper you go, the more dangerous it gets because you're using up resources, and it becomes a grip it and rip it game. And then you get rid of all those like death saves. It's like, look, you hit 0, you're unconscious. If you're less than 0, you're dying. If somebody doesn't heal you within 10 minutes, you're a goner, right? And so, and I think people are starting to come around to the idea of like, it's kind of boring if there's no risk, like there's excitement and fun to risking it all,
Yeah.
And if you don't want to, whatever, I don't care.
Sure, again, because it's fun for different people. But yeah,
the game police aren't going to come around and like check on your game group and be like, ooh, slap your hands. But yeah, I mean, now that 5e is essentially, Hasbro, WotC, well, they can't even produce decent product for it because they just produce garbage anyway. But the rules are there for the players to do whatever they want with it, And so you can start home ruling your own system to make it a little bit rougher and more like a rougher in terms of dangerous. And make it more like an OSR game. And suddenly you're playing. I mean, we have a supplement for Tanisborg that's a download. I should get you a copy of that. It's like a PDF, and it just converts all the stats for Tanisborg to a 5e game. And then it gives you a list of like rules that you want to change, like the undead. One of the scariest things in original D&D is running into like wights and wraiths. Sure. Because
some of these guys are draining levels, right?
Yeah, you're losing a level in experience.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh my God, I just, and in old D&D, it might take you. There's a write-up in the Dragon magazine, and it's probably 4 or 5 years. It's maybe 4 years into D&D having been published, if that, maybe 2 years. And Gary's saying like, yeah, I'm hearing about these campaigns and people are like 9th level and 10th level. And he's like, in Blackmoor, maybe the most powerful player is like 6th level or 8th level. In my campaign, we're only to 6th level. It's like, you guys are like handing out the points too easy, And,
you need more whites in that game.
Yeah, so if you're thinking in terms of like, oh my God, I've been playing for a year and I'm 4th level, and you have one encounter and the whites go bing and give you the magic love tap, and suddenly you're like, oh, I'm 3rd level, and then they do it again next round. It's like, ooh, I'm 2nd level, and that's kind of like, and that ties in with all the whole balance idea too. People,
oh yeah,
as a kid, we looked at these games. Even back in the day, we were looking at this stuff. Like the first question was like, gee, these make-believe games are basically, we're like going into places and like killing stuff and taking its stuff, like killing things and like this is kind of immoral. It's like, oh, wait a minute, it's just a make-believe. It's okay, And then the other one was the idea of balance, where I kept trying to think of how to balance encounters. And I finally realized, oh, it's the players who balance the encounters. And I have a whole thing on my blog, actually, a whole thing about encounter balance. And you have 3 options, as rough outlines of options as a player.
Okay.
You can talk to the thing. Maybe the thing doesn't want to talk to you and it attacks you, or maybe you want to attack it. Okay, so you can fight the thing. Well, what if the thing is really big and mean? That's when you take option 3, which is run away.
Yeah.
And when you run away, that's when you've balanced the encounter, because if you stay, it's going to be bad news. And so people...
I like that a lot, yeah.
Yeah, so balance involves... Like, I had a dungeon when I was a kid. I made this one dungeon, and you'd go in, and it was this, giant... I forgot what the room was, if it was a cave or a giant, temple-like thing. Well, the first thing you run into is this giant ancient dragon that's sleeping in there.
The first thing. Yeah.
And the whole idea is the players are look, don't even talk to it. Go down the side of the room, find a passage, and go into the dungeon. Do not wake up the dragon or you're dead.
Yeah.
I don't even need to roll dice. It's so big and nasty. It's just going to look at you. It's not even going to breathe fire on you. It's just going to snort at you. And a little snort of fire is going to wipe out all of you little first-level peons, And but it was the idea was to teach my players, you're the one that balances you get to pick. You pick it. And in fact, I mean, have you ever TPK'd a party? It's not like you really want to.
I have not, yeah.
No. I've TPK'd a whole party at GaryCon, this last GaryCon. I just took out 12 characters in one room. It was awesome. And but they chose to go there, right?
Exactly.
And TPKs don't actually happen because usually you have your fighters up front, they're fighting. The magic users are in back casting spells. The clerics are kind of in between doing their little healing thing. And as the front ranks start to drop, the rest of the party just runs away.
Sure. Some people should get to escape. But
then they're
I think
lost without a map and without torches, and they just starve to death in the dungeon. But anyway, they get to live longer.
I just love that point of there are 3 options, because I think maybe a theme among modern games is there's the talking, the social, and the combat. But I think very rarely do people consider fleeing from the encounter.
That's old school play there.
But you're very right that it's that's kind of the key to balance, is the players realizing when they shouldn't bother. And actually, a session that I played in somewhat recently was a level 0 funnel in Dungeon Crawl Classics, and it was the first encounter when we were fighting this thing that was really, really big. And now in DCC we have 12 characters among us, 4 players or so, and a couple of us went down. And then at some point the judge, called the thing the World Ender. And we're like, okay, we're definitely not supposed to be doing this right now. And we ran away. And, and then we ended up circling back, and so sort of faced it later among different circumstances where things were better in our favor. But it's picking up on those cues and realizing that you can't actually win everything.
No, you don't.
It's part of
Yeah. No, I think that's the biggest lesson to teach your players. I sort of do that with new players. I just brutalize them, and it's because they need to learn their limits. It's if you go into, say, a dungeon and you do we quietly sneak down the hallway. We're not marching in there like it's a shopping center. We're not going to the toy section, right? We're sneaking down slowly and listening as we go and looking around and checking the floor, checking the ceiling, because things go plop. And and then we find a door, and it's what do you want to do? And it's okay, we listen at the door. What do we hear, right? What are we going to hear here? And and it's well, you hear lots of clumping sounds, and maybe tango music. I don't know, but it sounds like somebody big is in there, and it's you look around at your friends and we're all first level and it's big, maybe.
Yeah, maybe not.
You don't even open the, I don't want to know what's in there. You don't open the door.
I think I think you're right, that's probably a big deciding factor between, maybe what gives a game the old school feel and what gives it a more modern feel, is just that tension of, we're we might not be designed to make it out of this. basically.
Right.
So
you have to exploit your advantages and avoid your disadvantages.
Right.
Yeah.
You have to run from the 4 kobolds with bows and come back with the big door or whatever, so you can block the arrows and and think through those things.
Well, and I don't know if they're providing those tools in newer systems. I bought a 5e start set, and I read it, and I couldn't understand how to play it. And I found there were certain things in the rules that I was like, okay, I need to find a reference to this. So I'm looking for an index or an appendix or something that gives me, like an explanation of this rule, and it wasn't in there. And so I never played 5e because I was like, I can't even learn how to play this. This is so badly written.
5e gets a lot of credit for being like a quote unquote simple RPG, but I really think it is only simple compared to maybe what existed
Pathfinder.
in like 3rd edition and Pathfinder
5e.
and what had just come before it. Because the further you go back, the shorter and shorter the rule books tend to get, I think. So
well, and there are so many other systems out there. I keep saying that.
Right.
It's like you don't have to play a fantasy setting. There's sci-fi stuff. There's incredible sci-fi stuff, or like cyberpunk, or or Wild West, or pick 2 settings and mash them together like I did.
Right. Have your spaceship over the planet and
hamsters of the Wild West. We're all hamsters, and the bad guys are the bunnies, or something. I don't know.
So thinking about like putting all these different settings together, but if we want to go back to like the Blackmoor setting, kind of the topic of the broad topic of this conversation, and like the documentary, what else did you want to like touch on that? Some of the major points for the listener here.
Well, the movie didn't really go into the campaign itself that much. D&D as a subject is so huge that it's really hard to like people. Yeah. There are like 5 other movies that tried to make a movie on D&D and they couldn't finish. They just failed, Huh. And like another movie has bought the assets of another one, and they're saying they're going to be out in a year. I'm like, I want to see it because I'd like to see a movie that I haven't made, right? I'm as curious about this D&D stuff as anybody else. But even Blackmoor is a very personal setting for Dave Arneson. It's like I think it's hard for anybody to really, I think you can, Tonnisborg is kind of like is a good example of my approach to Blackmoor, is that you have ideas and we can teach you ideas through these books of how to make your own thing. But anybody running Blackmoor, like I think that a lot of the way the modules are designed now, they try to lock down how you can do things and what you can do and where you can go and who do you meet. If you're playing in the old way, it's much more freestyle, and so anybody who's running a Greyhawk campaign, their campaign is going to be different from another person's, right? You got the same map, kind of same rules. We can agree we're playing Greyhawk. But the same thing with Blackmoor. It's just really hard I think it's very hard for somebody to approach Blackmoor because there isn't a lot of information out there. Yeah. I actually happen to be writing a book on Blackmoor right now.
Cool. And that was one of my questions. We have the Blackmoor movie, the Tonnisborg book. Are we getting a Blackmoor book? Yeah.
Well, I'm talking to Dan, who wrote Tonnisborg with me, and Greg. I want to do a Blackmoor setting book that's kind of an outline of what you would need as basic ideas for Blackmoor. But I don't want to be really specific, and I think there's the idea of RPGs as product, and so you get the game rules and then you get the modules, and a lot of people feel uncomfortable creating their own stuff, and it's just like, it's not that hard. You're just playing with your friends. Nobody's watching over your shoulder, and then if you do something wrong this week, next week you just say, hey, I know the river was running uphill last week, and that was a mistake. So this week the river runs downhill for like every other river, okay? And everybody goes like, okay, it was fun that way, but it might be fun this way, right? And when nobody cares. And so, with this book I'm writing on Blackmoor, I'm just dealing more with how to present Blackmoor. And I talked to Dave Arneson's daughter, and because I'm really... It's a delicate when you have a seminal campaign setting, and you're going to write about it, and so in a sense you become the voice of that campaign setting, right? Yeah. And that's a lot of responsibility, and my attitude is like, look, I'm going to present you with a lot of stuff on how to do Blackmoor. You don't have to use all of it. There's a lot of research you can do on your own on the web and go talk to people and find out stuff. And you can decide for yourself what your Blackmoor is going to be like and make your own Blackmoor. Even making the movie.
I would say that kind of touches on what we brought up earlier, how like Greg Svensson was a little anxious about running in, the town of Blackmoor.
Right,
but
so he gets his own space.
But ultimately they still, of course, published a Blackmoor book so everybody could play in it. So it's just balancing that idea of like, of what, maybe we think are like the core things that kind of make it Blackmoor, but then how you can still make it your own Blackmoor. And it's
I imagine, fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, I imagine you're kind of like literally the expert here on Blackmoor, so I think you're well poised to present that in a
I mean, I don't want to own it. I feel like there are people, there are different facets of Blackmoor. I'm the expert on the Blackmoor bunch. I've talked to all of them. I know all about their lives. I know them. They're my friends. Yeah. As far as the Blackmoor setting, well, that was what I was going to say with Malia. I was like, Malia, I want to write a book on Blackmoor, but I'm really worried. And she was like, Griff, just do whatever you want, Like, Dave would love it, like she was like, I think you're like really in line with what Dave wanted, and so you can take Blackmoor and make it into something. And so what I'm doing is I'm keeping all the main characters that were players as an option, and I'm saying like you can set your campaign like 50 years later, and all of these old, like the Wizard of the Wood never got killed, because he had a tendency to like just charge into battle with his dagger and no armor, and he'd get killed and have to resurrect him, and finally it was like, you're done. You got fried by the dragon. We can't resurrect you. Get a new character, Peter. But all these people are there, and they're like NPCs, and they're your mentors within the world. And so that's how I run it. I ran some guys in Brazil over Zoom, and they got to meet, the great Svenny and the king. The king was Dave Arneson, because Arneson, when he started the campaign, actually was the king of Blackmoor. And and just have fun with it. I mean, if people get really bent out of shape about it being this way or that, and I'm just like, just throw everything in the hopper. Like I'm going to write a section about the I call them the Mantids, but they're really the Pechoi from Tecumel in a sense, and but they live on these like floating cities. When I did my mashup campaign, because it was like a giant space station with different levels, and the Pechoi type creatures lived on an upside down world because their feet could cling, and so it was this city that was built upside down, and so like
sounds hard for nobody characters to navigate. Yeah.
Right. Well, they got taken as visitors, but they had to be like held onto, by the Pechoi guys or the Mantids, because otherwise they walked into the plaza and there was an execution happening, and they had one of them tied up and hanging from a rope, and they cut the rope and they just plummeted down. And it was like, that's how they get rid of the criminals in their society. They just like cut them loose and watch them fall for like 1,000 feet. But so I was like, the idea of like just this floating magical stone island, but they live underneath it and they walk underneath it, like things like that. And that's not in Blackmoor, but Arneson would have been like, "Ooh, that's cool. Let's do that," because that's the way he was with his players. People would suggest
thing. It sounds like is that he was very open to the player feedback and just finding a way to make it work.
Well, and that's the whole collective thing of like the campaign isn't just coming from the dungeon master's mind,
right?
Like
or
the
just
temple,
one book or whatever. Yeah,
the Temple of the Frog. It actually Dave asked Rockford to come up with something. He was like, I need a bad guy. Can you just come up with an idea for a bad guy? So Rockford went off for the weekend and he came up with this crazy idea that he based off a Star Trek episode. And then Dave took those ideas and made the module, and the players arrived. And Rockford describes, I've got interviews where he's like, I was playing in the party. I invented the thing, so I just hung back and I didn't say anything. And I just watched them, And so they're like they get blasted by the hands phaser and knocked out and abandoned in the middle of the forest. And they wake up and they're like, what the heck was that? And Rockford knows what happened, and he's like, oh, I don't know. We should just be really careful approaching this one. It looks really dangerous, right? But he's in on the joke,
Right.
And so, so I think that there needs, I don't know, do whatever you want, but it's fun when people kind of take part in the creation of the world and come up with ideas. And so you have this collective setting.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the other thing about when we started the movie, one of the big, that's what I wanted to get into with the movie, just to kind of cover some of the serious stuff. But the big sticking point was everybody was talking about, in the research community, they were all looking at rules. And so they were looking at the D&D rules, and they were trying to chase down where the D&D rules come from and who invented D&D.
Okay.
And I was like, well, wait a minute. The main thing that you see in role-playing games is the behaviors. And so when you're looking at the behaviors, you see the same behavior if you're playing Tunnels and Trolls, which was the second published RPG, as you do in D&D. The rules are entirely different. So maybe the rules aren't the critical element here. And I would say the same even for when people are doing their campaigns. Like, look at, if you don't like your rules, change them. It's not going to change your game, too much, unless you do something really drastic. But and so that was one of the things that we really had to go into with the research, was like, okay, we're looking at behaviors. We're not looking at rules, because the rules for D&D are created by, it's Arneson is sending Gary. Arneson shows up and shows Gary Gygax his Blackmoor game, and the rules are entirely different. And Arneson is using like linear equations and stuff for his mechanics and stuff like that. And so then Gary takes what Arneson is doing and sort of simplifies it. But Gary's also really like obsessed with his chainmail game, and he wants to promote his chainmail game. So Gary infuses chainmail into the D&D rules. And so when people say like, oh, well, it's based on chainmail, it's like, well, yeah, it's because Gary put it in there, right? But the ideas that Arneson, the behaviors that Arneson is using are coming from Wesley's Brownstein games.
Right,
And, Brownstein is even more role-playing oriented than, well, it's more character play. It's more play act oriented than D&D.
Exactly, right. That's my interpretation of it. It's like everybody had a role. I don't even know how character statistics were really involved. Like if that
there's
was
no statistics,
a big part of it.
Nothing. No,
right,
you got
okay. It's just solving almost like a mystery among these people.
It's like
right?
those mystery games. Those kind of came out of that, I think. And even role playing, like the definition of role playing, we had to sort of. I've been working a long time to come up with a definition for role playing, and the only thing I could come up with was that you have like make believe, which is an informal game. There's no formal. There are no formal rules to role playing. Like if you watch little kids playing make believe, they're like, okay, let's pretend that we're ponies. You and I are going to be ponies, Bob. We're going to run around in the field, and we are ponies. We have established the setting, right? We are ponies, or we have established ourselves. We are running around in a field, and there are flowers, and the flowers are delicious, and we're eating the flowers, and they're just the most delicious flowers, right? And then Bob's, you'd be like, yeah, but then the giant, I don't know, the bee comes along, and it's trying to sting us. Ah! So we run around, and then, like you watch kids play make-believe, and it's like if you said like, and then the bee stings you and kills you, and I'd be like, no, you've broken, that's not my make-believe, right? But that's make-believe, that's an informal game. And then you have a formal game like chess or Monopoly where you have rules, and it's like everybody takes a turn, you move. And so what Dungeons and Dragons, really what Blackmoor does, even what Brownstein does, what those two games, Brownstein and Blackmoor, do is they take the idea of this informal game structure of make-believe, and they combine it with rules, but very minimal rules.
Right.
And the reason you know this is because, like, the most important thing is that the informal game is the most important thing. It drives everything, because when you play like an original D&D, well, the map is one of the rules, right? The Dungeon Master has a map. And you say like, okay, we all know that you can't walk through stone. So it's like, okay, where am I? It's like, oh, there's a passage leading this way. It's like, okay, we're going to go down the passage, right? So, and we're agreeing through make-believe that we're going down the passage, right? Then we get to the end of there's a door at the end of the tunnel, right? Well, we're not using any rules to say there's a door at the end of the tunnel, except for maybe the map rule, because the DM looks at the map and says there's a door at the end of the tunnel. It's like, okay. What do you want to do with the door? Do you want to set it on fire? Do you want to, I'm going to listen at the door. Well, there's a rule for listening at doors. In original D&D, you just roll a d6, right? And, 1 or 2, you hear what's in there. But everything is predicated on the make-believe. You don't use the rule You're not using the door listening rule, or I want to open the door opening rule, until the player says, I want to do the thing, and it's like, oh, I got a rule for the thing. And the reason I have a rule is to make it fair, right? Mm-hmm. And there are so many things that you don't need a rule for. And I was talking to Karen Abakal, he's one of the Empire of the Petal Throne guys, and this is just an amusing thing I always repeat, but he's like, yeah, now if my character eats the caviar, I got to roll on the chart to see if the character, like, does my character like caviar? I don't know. I got to roll on the chart, right? Old school play, it's just like, yes, my character likes caviar because I want my character to like caviar. It has no, little things like that have no scope as far as you dying, or something like that.
Yeah. But, summed up, I think, as the rulings over rules. That phrase often associated with like old school style.
Well, and it's more about being able to create a magical, enchanting experience for your players, and that's the minute. See, in original D&D, people would play and they didn't even have the rules, and you didn't need the rules as a player, right? When Arneson started running his campaign, he didn't even let the characters see their character sheet or roll the dice. They would just tell him what they were doing, and he'd roll dice behind his screen.
Okay.
And they didn't know. And he just had to be fair, because if he was crappy to his players and it didn't seem fair, they weren't going to come back next week, right? So there's the rule of fair, too. That's another rule that's important that comes from make-believe.
Well, I think that's why, like you said, like there are rules for the common behaviors that characters are going to do again and again, because it has to be consistent between them to be fair. Yeah.
Wesley talks about,
we said, it's a D6 this week to listen to the door, but then the GM forgot what it was and then said it's a D20, and 1 out of 2, you hear what it says, then the players would, right. So, yeah.
And there are we found a really old character sheet when we were making the movie, and the character sheet comes from, it's on those maps you have that I gave you, those poster maps there. It's called the Royal Spanish Character Matrix, and it's on one of those maps. And it lists the entire royal family, and it has stats for them. And it may be derived, like Arneson was deriving stuff.
It might be this.
Yeah, that's it right there. It's like the oldest character sheet in existence.
Yeah.
And Arneson was using ideas that he was getting from gamers even in England, But nobody, up to the point where Arneson did his game, nobody was doing this sort of thing, the sort of double blind thing of like, you don't know what's out there, like Wesley's game. Wesley solves the problem of character knowledge by revealing a map, and players just say, I'm going over here, or they move their counter over here. And then you can role play and interact with the people that are near you, or in Banania, you can call them on the phone, and so he kind of, the idea of exploration isn't part of the game. I call Arneson's creation the adventure game. And then later it dawned on me, like, he named his company Adventure Games. Interesting. But the whole idea is it's very much like the perspective as a player is a lot like the perspective you would have watching an adventure movie, like Indiana Jones, like the opening scene of Indiana, the first Indiana Jones movie, is a dungeon dive, like he goes into the temple and then he tries to steal the idol, and he somehow gets out, by the skin of his teeth. And it's a D&D game,
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, what was I going to say about that? I get lost when I start ranting on this stuff. But
maybe thinking about the rules and the the lack thereof. Yeah.
Well, I think just it's the idea of the adventure game is that what Arneson creates is this thing that is very magical. I mean, like, now everybody's used to it, but imagine being with Dave Arneson and you go down to his basement and you thought you were going to play like a Napoleonic battle, and you look at the table and he's got all these HO structures put, like model train buildings, on the table, and it's this town, and he's got stuff and forests and rivers and a bay drawn on this, and there's a castle there, and he's like, we're going to do this new thing, and you're this guy and you're that guy and you're that guy.
Yeah.
And nobody's ever, to me, it's just mind-blowing to have somebody to have the forethought, the understanding that you have the agency to say, look, Dave, I really want to be a vampire. And it's like, okay. So he runs a solo adventure with Dwayne Jenkins, where Dwayne goes into the basement of the castle and a vampire bites him. And then he's like, this is the very first campaign. It's set in the Middle Ages, but you've got a gothic horror vampire character as a player in this, right? And he's trying to play a good vampire. He's torn. He doesn't want to drink people's blood. He wants to be, he bases his character totally on dark shadows. And then you got another guy that's like, I want to be Gandalf, and I want to be a wizard. It's like, okay. And they don't have any rules, so it's like when they run into, like in the very first few sessions, it's just like, I want to cast a spell that makes the floor slippery. It's like, okay, we'll roll some dice and see if you succeed or you fail, right? I mean, yeah, I don't know. I think
hard
it's
to
interesting.
Capture the level of like how innovative it was, because nobody was doing this, and then of course how everything was. Like you said, kind of the grip it and rip it style of we're sort of making it up as we go along.
Yeah.
And fortunately, Dave also just had the attitude of agreeing with the players' fun. Accepting what they wanted to do, because ultimately that's how you make sure everybody has fun at the table, is trying to understand what your players want. And if they can tell you what they want, and then you just find a way to incorporate it, that's the magic right there. And from the beginning, Dave was successful at that.
Yeah. Well, and you have to have he created a buy-in for everybody, even himself. It's like, I want to have fun as a dungeon master, right?
Oh,
so I got to do certain things that entertain me, and my players have to have fun. And they, if they know that I'm being fair and I'm rolling dice, like I'm not just saying like the giant bee came and killed your pony. You're a terrible DM, Bob. You killed my pony. But you say like, okay, you run it. You're going to fight this thing. It rolls a die. You roll a dice. You got higher. You win. Right.
Right.
Simple, but at least you got a chance. Right. And so you've got a buy-in for your players, and then so they're willing to say like, well, last time I won, but this time it was a troll, and it got to roll 2 dice, and and it just did me in. I'm like honor. But yeah, I don't know where I really wanted to talk about that though, like the ideas of like what we needed to establish as sort of standards for understanding D&D, and the idea that the rules, that the rules had nothing to do with this, and that the entire research community was wrong for the past 50 years about what they were doing, and they needed to be looking at the behaviors. And then also that D&D is not the primary reference point for all of this. I think people get confused because it's such a big product. And even more so now, I hope you're not offended, but I really just don't care if Hasbro WotC just burns to the ground, because I play original edition.
Yeah.
I don't need them.
I think at this point, especially after, not to cut you off, but I think at this point, after like the whole OGL thing, I think everybody realized that if they hadn't already, because of course, like many people who came into the hobby before Hasbro or Wizards of the Coast was part of it anyway. But for newer folks like myself who came in when they were kind of running stuff, it took me a while before I even learned that Hasbro was behind WotC or whatever. I think by now with the OGL, everybody has realized like, okay, there are a lot of games doing the same, or trying to capture the same magic and succeeding in their own ways. And for 40 years before Wizard of the Coast got on board, people were doing the same things and even having the same debates over rules and whatever. So it's like the game will go on after them, and just as it went on before them. If
you want crunch, there's like the old SPI, Simulation Publications Incorporated, did Swords. What was it called? Dragon Quest. And there's a module by Janelle Jacques, which is probably the best module ever written. If you can find it, I think it was called The Enchanted Forest. Even if you don't play the game, you should read the module, because the ideas in it are just stunning. Like, it warped my brain when I was like 18, there's like all this stuff out there. Like, Hasbro WotC, get rid of those guys. You don't need them. If you play 5e, it's your game. Like, the minute you buy the game, it's your game. Go home. If there's anything you don't like in the rule book, just take a big marker and cross it out. Like, cross out where it says Hasbro WotC first. That's what you got to get rid of. And then it's your game, and you can do whatever you want with it, and you just have fun with your friends, and send those guys packing, because you don't need them,
Yeah. I think
and you're part of the OSR with all of us.
I would say
What's
probably
that?
something I should have referenced at the beginning of this, because I don't know if it ever came up in our emails, was that the reason that I think a lot of the history of the game resonates with me, or I resonate with the history or whatever, is because when my friends first started playing D&D, like it was one of my friends, who's like my best friend, we're still playing together. He asked if we wanted to play. I had only heard of it from like TV and movies before and stuff, didn't really have much of a frame of reference for the game. He had the 5e Player's Handbook, but that was the only book we had. None of the players, like we didn't ever read anything out of it. And we pretty much made up our classes. Like we, you know, it really was just him asking us like what we wanted to do, you know, from character creation to like in the moment of gameplay as well. And then a lot of my like own journey through D&D, and like I got really into the rules for a while, but then realized like I was having just as much, if not more fun back when I didn't have to memorize all this stuff. So that's where I've kind of like come back to this. And now hearing how that's kind of like how things began with, you know, Dave, at like one of Dave's friends asking, oh, can I be a wizard? Like, it's just, that's the exciting part for me, is hearing how people were playing all these different ways, you know, the whole time. So,
yeah. I mean, that's one of the things, just to plug our movie. You can find our stuff, thefellowshipofthething.com. That's our company name, The Fellowship of the Thing. Chris and I just do weird stuff, and so we called it that. But the thing that I hear most from all the different people that watch our movie is that they're like, it's changing how I play my games. I'm DMing differently, you know, I'm playing differently, and it's doing it for the better, and it has nothing to do with learning rules. It's just like, it's really opened me up to like, I have so much agency to do so much more in my game, you know? And so yeah, I just hear that over and over. It's like, you watch this movie,
yeah, that's great.
Your game better, you know? And it makes me happy, because I want people to get something that they can take away with it. Yeah, I mean,
that sounds like what you hope, like part of what you probably wanted out of making the movie, right? Was inspiring people with these original methods of play. Even
the Tonicsborg book, there's a whole section on how to be a dungeon master, and people were kind of critical, like, well, I already knew that. That's just common knowledge. And it's like, well, actually it's not, because nobody's written about that. Like Hasbro doesn't have a book on how to be a good like things you can do as a DM to make your game more interesting. You don't use all the different things in every game, but you've got this like smorgasbord of ideas that you can use with your players to make your game more interesting and more exciting and more enchanting, and you know, and we have a book for it. But there are other books out there that do the same thing too.
And so if you had to recommend like one of your books or the movie or something, just as like a starting place for people who are trying to get into this stuff and learn about it, what would be like your top recommendation for somebody?
My top well, the movie, I mean, it's like, it costs almost nothing, and you get like over 2 hours of stuff about gaming, you know, and you get to hear the old guys that invented this stuff talk about it, you know. And
yeah, I'll add as a little testimonial, like seeing and hearing from some of the characters who are like, oh yeah, like I played the first dwarf like ever. That's really interesting stuff, and I think that's just something fun to witness and realize, like, oh yeah, that's just like a guy who's still around, you know. Like there's a weird frame of reference. People don't understand like when or how this all really unfolded, and having those touchstones of just hearing it from these people themselves, I think is really inspiring.
I'm just so glad you invited me on your show, by the way. I've been wanting to talk to you. Like, I watch you on YouTube, and so it's like, it's just me sitting there, but I can't interact with you. And so to finally be able to be with you and just be like, hey, let's talk gaming, you know, that's just freaking awesome. So thanks a lot for having me on the show.
It was good to have you. This has been fun.
Yeah.
Check out the website. And
we've got like, we're working on all kinds of new stuff. I'm working with David Wesley to do a Brownstein game book. And so we've been doing Zoom talks where I talk him through the game like he's running me in a game, and I'm taking notes, and I'm like really analyzing what he does and breaking it down. We're doing the space game, which is amazing. People who have seen pieces of the charts and stuff are like, I've never seen anything like this, and this comes out of the 70s. Are you kidding me? You know? And then we'd like to see if people are interested in wargaming stuff. We have some cool war game stuff we'd like to do, but we're not sure if it'll sell. So maybe if people are like talking to us, maybe reproduce the Strategos, Wesley's Strategos variant. What else?
So there's a whole lot of projects in the works, it sounds like. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all old school stuff. It's all for nerds, you know. I mean, it's not like stuff that's going to sell 1 million copies, but it's cool to be preserving these old. We've discovered so many old games. You know, it's cool to be preserving it. Just tell me when to shut up, Bob, because I can just go on.